Right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And if you're watching the replay, whatever time of day it is, good day to you. It's great to have you here in conversation with Graeme Codrington. And today, as you can see on your screens, I am interviewing Mark Sanborn. Mark and I met each other many, many years ago when I went across to the United States to the Professional Speakers Association, or as they call it in the US, the National Speakers Association. And he and I have kind of intersected many times since then. So I'm really excited about this today. Settle in. Get yourself something to drink if that's your style. And just to familiarize yourself with our system on Webinar Jam, if this is your first time in a jam, just go to the chat box on the right-hand side if you're on a computer, or somewhere on your phone, just swipe up, left, right, whichever version of the phone system you're on, and just pop in your name and where you are dialing in from today. We won't have the option today for you to speak any questions to us, but you are welcome at any stage to type your questions into that chat box. So just going into the chat box now will familiarize you and yourself with where that chat box actually is. Don't be shy. Go in and just say hi in the chat box. Right, and I think we can get started with that. Hey, Steve, you got in first today. Hi from the north of England. And then we've got a few people from Johannesburg. Matthew or Matt Columbus. No, that wouldn't be Matt Columbus. That's Matt from Columbus, Ohio. So you're our first US guy. Early morning for you joining us live today. Right, everybody else, you're coming in. Welcome to In Conversation with Graeme Codrington, and today we are speaking to Mark Sanborn. Mark, let me bring you in. Here I've been talking about you, but let me talk to you now. Mark is based out of Denver, Colorado. He's a leadership speaker, best-selling author, focusing on everything from customer and staff engagement, but really looking at the issue of leaders, how to develop leaders at every level of the organization. Mark, it's great to be chatting to you today. How are you doing in your Denver version of lockdown?
Well, Graeme, we're doing great. You know, I was going to say it's great to join you through the magic of technology, but unless you're my age, it's not magic. It's ubiquitous. You know, our kids are used to this, and it's a whole new world, but it's still terrific to have so many people connected around the world. Denver's been great. We're not quite reopened yet. We're still shelter in place, but everyone's thinking perhaps around the 1st of June, restaurants will start slowly reopening. So we're surviving and thriving as best we can.
So, Mark, let's just dive straight into this. People know what they've signed up for watching this webinar. If you're live with us, it's great to have you with us. If you're watching the replay, we want to talk about leadership in a time of crisis. And I know your most recent book is called The Intention Imperative, right? And there are three things that you think leaders need to really focus on. I'm guessing this is even more important during a time of crisis now, isn't it?
Well, I wondered if my book would withstand the crisis test, the COVID-19 test, because it's a little bit like opening a restaurant just before COVID hits. The timing is such that I didn't know what would necessarily happen. But as I now have 2 or 3 months of data and conversations and work with different clients, you're right, Graeme, these principles hold up very well because the premise of the book is simple. The basic ground level, you can't go any more basic than this, is intentionality, being crystal clear on what you're trying to accomplish as a leader and taking appropriate action every day to accomplish it. And, the two reasons I think leaders fail is they either don't know what it is they're trying to achieve, or they know what they're trying to achieve, but they're not taking consistent action. And that sounds simple, but I've worked with so many clients from small businesses to Fortune 100 companies where that was the primary sticking point. The rest of the book is devoted to what I think are the three big shifts that people needed to make pre-COVID. And I'm not just saying this to support my work, but I really believe these shifts, as you alluded to, are even more important now coming out of crisis.
So Mark, take us through them. I've put them up on the screen for people to see it. Structure to culture, motivation to inspiration, experience to emotion. Take us through those.
Let's look at the first one. Structure is your organizational structure. It's your org chart. But I'm guessing when crisis hit, it probably didn't serve you as well because the linear delineations and the connectivity was scrambled by the crisis itself. Culture, which is probably the most talked about word in leadership, but the least understood, I define simply as everything we think and believe that results in what we do and achieve. And if you think of it this way, my son was just home and he is a gym rat. He's got 7% body fat, which I have, I think, in just one earlobe. But we have the same bone structure, but how the muscle completes his body versus mine is radically different. So structure supports, but it doesn't create. And I'm guessing that people went back to their values and their commitments and their collegiality and their belief and vision and their trust to their leaders. And those are the soft things that make up culture. I'm not saying that structure isn't important. I'm saying structure isn't enough. The second shift.
Before we move on, let's just interrogate that a little bit, because I've been doing some work with clients over the last few weeks who are, my work is as a futurist, which doesn't mean I can predict the future. I wish I could. But in looking at the trends and looking at what's happening, we're pretty convinced that we're going to be in some form of disruption for the next 12 to 18 months. I think physical distancing and being careful of travel and being too many people in one place at one time is going to be the normal for the next year and a bit. And in that environment, a lot of teams are struggling. As you say, maybe they didn't realize how rigid their structures were because they were just in the process of coming into the office every day and going through the routine. Now suddenly that some of those superficial layers of structure are gone, they're realizing they didn't really have a great culture to start with. Would that be why you think culture is more important, or is maybe the layer on top of structure that leaders haven't looked at enough in the last little while?
Well, structure is based on the belief that we can create a process, get it up and running, and that process will serve us well. I've been telling my clients in crisis, especially today, that experimentation and agility trump planning and process. And so when people are very focused on what needs to be done and why it needs to be done, they become very inventive. And unfortunately, historically, structure can prevent that from happening because people don't feel empowered to try things and experiment. And if they work, keep doing them. And if they don't work, adjust them or quit doing them. So you're exactly right. I think that we need to remember that most things in life aren't or, they're and. It's structure and culture. But structure is pretty easy. Culture is very hard. And Graeme, everybody's got their pet phrase now. I like to call it the new abnormal, because if you think you ever reach normal, you become flat-footed and complacent, and you get blindsided. And for me, it was an epiphany. You've got smart listeners. Maybe you and your listeners already had this, but we as leaders want certainty. And now I hear leaders go, what bothers me most is so much uncertainty. We've always had uncertainty. Certainty was an illusion, because I guarantee you a year ago, if you polled 1,000 leaders, 999.9 would have been pretty certain we wouldn't be shut down with a global pandemic. In other words, we know things can happen, but we are pretty certain they won't happen. And so we set up processes and plans that get totally annihilated when change, especially big change, inevitably happens.
For me, Mark, that's the opportunity that exists here. And that's why I think, and that's why I wanted to interview you, because I think a book like yours will stand the test of time, because you were trying to help your clients get ready for the unexpected world. And I suppose part of your job was trying to convince them that they were living in a world that had unexpected things in it. Now that piece is obvious. So the message then around culture and structure and the dynamic between them is just, it's common sense now almost.
Isn't it funny how common sense is always common sense in the rearview mirror, but when you're looking out the windshield, it's a total anomaly, you know. And I really think there's going to be more positive change that comes out of this than negative change. And that's not to downplay the human cost and suffering and the economic suffering, because I'm not saying that. But I think you're going to see a revival in entrepreneurialism. I think you're going to see companies birthed out of this crisis. I think you're going to see companies that had become stodgy and staid, who realize they can't be that way anymore. So as tragic and terrible as it's been, there's going to be a lot of good that comes out of this if we handle it right. Because you don't manage your way out of a crisis. You lead your way out of a crisis.
Well, that leads perfectly then to the second point. So that's now motivation and inspiration.
When you were managing or leading from home, and I'm saying this generically to anyone who's watching or listening today, you probably were challenged with, how do I keep my employees engaged? They're working remotely. I don't have direct contact or supervision with them. One of the things I hope you did is you got them to focus not just on the tactical, but on the purposeful, on the mission, on the bigger reason why you were working so hard to stay in business and do what needed to be done. I like motivation. Motivation is carrot and stick. It says, if you do this, I'll give you this. You know, as much as we tend to, in the business community, make fun of millennials and people who are different than us, I love millennials, because 87% of millennials say they would rather do important work than be recognized by their employer. And that's really admirable, because to them, it's not just about making money. It's about making money and meaning. And I always kid around and say, you know, I'm a baby boomer. We sell our souls if you paid us enough money. And I'm only being half in jest, because money was a big motivator, but today money isn't enough. So here's how I define inspiration. Inspiration is motivation to the power of purpose. It's when you can say to an employee, sure, we're going to pay you fairly, we're going to give you the perks that you desire, but we're going to let you do significant work, good work, important work. We're going to work really hard so that you don't feel like you have to delay fulfilling the mission of your life in the evenings and on the weekends when you're not here at the office or at the plant or wherever it is that you work. And so it's just aiming a little north of motivation and saying, how can we bring purpose into the workplace so people feel good about the money they make and how they make the money?
Now, Mark, why? No, in fact, I was going to ask, why is that so important during a crisis? I think that's almost, that's a softball question. Let me ask it anyway. It's a softball question. I got a harder one. Why is that important, more important maybe in a crisis?
Well, we become discouraged. You know, I think that's one of the hardest things that leaders have had to do during this crisis is to be role models and not go through the motions, but be deeply discouraged, because mirror neurons in other people pick up on a real attitude. And it doesn't mean that you're a cheerleader. It just means that if you're a leader, you're responsible for motivating the motivator. That'd be yourself. That's a job of leadership. How do I stay motivated? And the way we stay motivated, since you gave me a nice softball question, I'll use a cliche answer. You know, Nietzsche, who said, he who has a reason why can bear almost any how. And you may not agree with everything Nietzsche said, but Nietzsche was onto something about how purpose is really what compels us. Motivation gives us a short-term reason, but purpose is a long-term reason. And leaders need to become good at understanding that purpose, and not just in the workplace, but what are the people that you lead? What's important to them? Putting their kids through college? Are they involved in a philanthropy? Do they have a hobby that they're passionate about? Because if you can link purpose, which is the real power, to motivation, then you've got a powerful combination.
Now, listen, if you are joining us live on this webinar, you are welcome to throw some questions into the chat box. We're not taking your questions verbally, but you can type them in, and I'm sure Mark will be able to pick them up in a moment. So now, back to the hardball question. Mark, what would a leader need to do now? Obviously, the best time to prepare for a crisis is about 2 years ago, and to put all of this stuff in your team. Assuming that the second best time is today, what would you recommend a leader would need to do with this whole inspiration and motivation piece? What would be the one or two things they could do that would really move the dial in the next few days?
Well, one is an inner world exercise and one is an outer world exercise. And the inner world exercise is, and hopefully some leaders have been doing this with the time when we seem to have excess time. the inner world exercise is to get really clear on your purpose, what drives you. You know, when I work with leaders, it's easy to help them with outward skills like speaking and managing and delegating and all the things that we do. But what I find is if you don't have a compelling reason why as a leader, you eventually bump up against that and you become very discouraged and go, I don't know why I'm busting my hump. Why am I working so hard? You got to get clear on your motivation. Then you've got to go to the outer world and say, how does this fit in with our business, regardless of what business you're in? You know, there are some decidedly unsexy businesses, Graeme, you and I have worked with, and yet some of the most purposeful businesses I know are people who don't put the focus on just what they're doing. That's important, but they know why they're doing it. Now, a stellar example here in the United States is St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. I had a chance to speak for them a year ago, and I had a tour of the facility, and I always knew they did amazing work for kids. That's what it's about, helping kids who can't afford the help to cure terrible diseases like cancer and other things. But what I found is everybody there is inspired by that same ethos, whether they worked in food service, and this sounds cliche, but it's absolutely true. If they're janitorial, if they were tour guides, everybody had that same inspiration of we're doing important work. Being a janitor, the job you do is important, but there's a difference between a janitor who's cleaning bathrooms and a janitor who feels part of that bigger purpose or mission.
So it's easy to see why working in a children's hospital that's curing diseases would be like what happens if you working in a bank or an insurance company and so on? How does a leader instill that sense of purpose? And apologies to pick on the financial services industry. It could be anywhere, because there is a purpose behind those things, but it doesn't necessarily filter down, does it? I mean, often it's get lost in translation further down the organization.
Well, without going too deep, I would say that you can, as a leader, help people find out what their particular purpose is, what they bring to the party every day. Dreyer's Grand Ice Cream in Oakland, California, years ago, I learned that one of their management philosophies was, as a leader, make sure everybody on your team is famous for something. In other words, you were to find what that one unique contribution was for every person that you led. And the reason was easy. About 1 million people call in sick every day in the United States, but they're not physically ill. They're sick of their employer or what they do or who they do it with. But if you're famous for something, and it's not a superficial thing, if you can really help somebody find their contribution, they got a reason to come into work every day because they're irreplaceable. I also think, Graeme, from the bigger picture, that I've been asked, what are customers going to want after the crisis? They're going to want the same thing they wanted before the crisis, and that is more success. But how they define success is going to change. In the past, success was having a great dinner and good service and an elegant ambiance. Now, safety and health trump the food and the service and the ambiance. So even though the application has changed, the principle hasn't changed. So as an exercise for people who are watching today, why don't you go back and say, what do our customers want? Now, success is a pretty broad category, but ask, how can you, in whatever financial services, hospital, and everything in between, how can you help people be more successful? By the way, I think financial services, that's the name of the game. Finding out what do people consider financial success and then helping them to achieve it.
Absolutely. So let's move on then to the third point. Let me get the list up there again, and you can talk us through it.
Experience to emotion. You know, my friends Pine and Gilmore wrote one of the seminal business books of all time, The Experience Economy. I love the book. It dramatically impacted how I thought about business. And they said it's not the commodity or the product or the service, it's the experience that you create for the customer that you should aim for. I think, with all respect to them, that we've gone beyond the experience economy to the emotion economy. And the question isn't, what experience did you create for your employees or your stakeholders or your customers, but how do they feel about it? Are they happier they work for you than your competitor down the street? Because if they're not, they'll probably end up working for your competitor down the street. Are your customers happier they chose to come to your establishment to buy their product than to a different establishment. And so what this means in essence is we've got to do something we've never overtly done before in business, global business, and that is design and deliver for emotion. Now, I, in writing the book, studied emotion more than I ever thought I would, and it depends on who you read, but there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 26 primary emotions. Some people parse it down to over 100. But the question is, what are the emotions you're trying to create? And then how can you reverse engineer it? Security, since we've already mentioned it, being one. Restaurants here in my business community in South Denver, where I have my office in Lone Tree, according to the people that were in their kitchens, said it was like a surge center. Immaculate, people wearing masks and gloves. They had these rigorous standards. And I said, well, then how come there were no pictures on their websites? Because you can say to somebody, we're taking all the precautions. But if you show somebody, it's going to make a big difference in the confidence they have in whether or not you want to order carry out or to-go food from those restaurants. So this is a fun one because there's a lot of emotions to draw from. And sometimes the way that you address the emotion economy is you take away the negative emotions. So coming out of this pandemic, what are some of the sticking points, or I call them pain points, that by removing those pain points, you can create value in the products, services, and experiences you deliver? Because here's the question. Are people happier they chose you than somebody else?
Now, Mark, I guess that we're going to see some very interesting things happening in this particular space because we're obviously all emotional about COVID-19. Whether we're emotional about because of our nervousness or even fear about the disease or somebody in our family who may even have been affected, or we're emotional about the economy, or we are emotional about our civil rights. I mean, everybody is on social media in all caps at the moment, just shouting in every direction. So emotions are high. How do you not get swept up in that? Because surely emotion can become too emotional, and then you make emotional decisions which maybe are not the best way to make it. How do you balance sort of the good and bad side of emotions as a leader?
Well, Graeme, that's a terrific question because actually, having studied emotion, if you sympathize or empathize with someone, if you feel the same way they feel, you increase that emotion, whether it's negative or positive. So if people are disgruntled and upset and you empathize at an emotional level, you actually feed the fire, if you will. You fuel the burn. So there's an important word because linguists have had to kind of separate what we used to call empathy from what they now call cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is when you understand how somebody feels without feeling the same way. It's where if somebody complains that they had to wait too long, you don't say, oh, I know exactly how you feel, because they can say, no, you don't. You didn't just wait an hour. What you say is, I understand how frustrating that is. Your time is valuable, and I apologize that we wasted it. And what you do is you address the emotion without increasing it if it's a negative emotion. And I think that's what leaders need to do. I think leaders need to really understand when they need to be excited and when they need to be calm. They need to have that cognitive filter. And there are times we want leaders to be forceful. We know what's important by what works a leader up or what gets a leader upset. But we also need to understand that emotions are autonomous, but behavior is chosen. So just because I feel angry doesn't mean I have to smack the person who is driving the taxi. That's immature behavior. Maturity is the ability to act appropriately, even if you feel differently. And those are some lessons that have always been important, but I think they're really timely now for leaders.
So, Mark, if people want to find out more about what you do, get hold of your book maybe and read it and go into a little bit more depth. I've put the link for those of you who are live. You can see it at the top of the chat box, marksanborn.com. But where else? I'm guessing your books are still available on Kindle, right? Even though we can't go to a bookstore.
They're on Kindle, they're ebooks, they're in print, easy to get through any of the major online book retailers or the local independents, who I have a great love for as well. And if your listeners, watchers go to marksanborn.com, they can download a free ebook. There's a pop-up. I apologize. We all hate pop-ups, but they can download my book, Always Win. Originally, it was titled Up, Down, or Sideways: How to Succeed When Times Are Good, Bad, or In Between. And it was written 10 years ago, right after we were coming out of the global recession of 2008. I didn't know, we were talking before we started to broadcast. History may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And I think some of the things that I write about in that book will rhyme and make sense to the people who read it. So marksanborn.com is the easiest place to get all things related to what I do.
Perfect. One more time, if you do have questions for Mark, we've got a few minutes left with him, throw them into the chat box for us. But Mark, let me just throw you, again, hopefully an easy question, but a very important one. So people have logged in, they'll be watching this video with this understanding of COVID-19. On one hand, it's a crisis, and it is. And you've got to get through the crisis and help your people get through it. On the other hand, and this is part of becoming almost a passion for me to talk about, it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to think differently about leadership, to get out of some of our old habits of how we just used to do things at the office. Some of the things that will be frustrating people while they're in lockdown and in virtual spaces might be triggers to actually reinvent their leadership, their team dynamics. If we speak to somebody who's beginning to move away from crisis and into an opportunity mindset, what would be a few pieces of advice you would give them to really up their game as a leader?
Well, let me suggest two. And the first one is to look for the pain points. There's only three ways you can create value: reducing pain, increasing joy, or both. And right now, there's probably a whole lot more pain than there is joy. So those will be, for lack of a better term, the low-hanging fruit. Look for the problems you can solve for your customer that he or she can't solve for him or herself. The second is a model, and it's kind of raw, but it was helpful to me. Graeme, you and I often stand in front of audiences to make our livelihood. And so for the foreseeable future, we are unemployed as professional speakers. However, the good news is that we all have what I call a core offering or a core skill. For me, it's sharing ideas to help people lead or lead better, sharing ideas to help people be more successful. My preferred context, you go from core to context, is the stage. I just have fun. I enjoy being in front of an audience and meeting audience members. However, the context has changed, but my core offering hasn't. So we look at things like digitization and the other things I was already doing, like recording videos and writing books and doing podcasts and writing blogs. So you ask yourself, how can I continue to use my core offering, my core skill set in this new context? The third part is the trick. It's the business part of it. And that is, how do we monetize that? How do we monetize that new context? So core, context, monetization. There's a model that you can play around with after you log off from this webinar.
Well, Mark, it looks as if you are just as at home in front of a camera in that studio of yours in Denver as you are on the stage. It would be lovely at some stage for us to share a stage. I think we've only done it once, and that was at an NSA. We'd love to do it. But you know what? Maybe it's this digital world where you and I get to share a screen, at least with some people. There are just one or two questions coming in. Let's just have a look here. So I'm just going to read it. I'm just going to read it out loud. So we are all doing what we can to stay productive and creative. But my question is wisdom to be calm and wait it out as best we can, or to be as proactive as possible? I know the second option is the sexy answer, but is it the right answer? It's a great question. I do a lot of work with a model called adaptive leadership that came out of Harvard. And one of the issues in adaptive leadership is when you hit a problem that you don't know how to solve, that you might even not know how to diagnose the problem. You get a team of people together and they can't even agree on what the problem is, let alone how to fix it. In that situation, one of the default settings of leaders is to do what we call busy work. So you go about doing the stuff you know to do. So you schedule meetings and you phone clients and you do whatever it is that you are good at doing and know how to do. The problem is it's avoidance. It's actually working hard, but it's really work avoidance, because the real work is to actually diagnose the problem. And maybe it comes to, the real work is to ask the question, what do my clients need right now? Not what do I want to do and what am I good at, but what do my clients really need? So, Idris, it's a great question. How would you answer that question? Work hard, be as productive as possible, or maybe breathe, step back and survey the scene?
It is a good question, and it's not easy to answer, but I would offer two thoughts. The first is get used to the idea you're not going to get it all right. No matter how well informed you are, no matter how much information you take in and you access and assess and process, nobody's going to get it all right. And I think leaders often think their job is to get it right. Their job is to be as informed as possible. And to not take unnecessary risks. Now, I know there's the debate, what is an unnecessary risk? But I always like to point out that mountain climbers, and I know a fair number, as I'm sure you do, Graeme, I don't know, maybe you climb. Mountain climbers, good ones, they're not risk takers. They're risk managers. In other words, they assess the risk and they use safety equipment or skill to mitigate the risk. They're not just up there trying things for the first time and hoping they don't fall to their death. And that's what a leader has to do. A leader has to be a risk mitigator. The other thing I would just add, because I think it's a global challenge, and that is we are all very big on self-rights. I think we need to be just as big on self-responsibility. And what I like about that question is it suggests that this person isn't just thinking about what's right for me, they're thinking about what's right for us. And leadership, true leadership, always benefits the greater good. And even though you may not get it perfectly right, the fact that you're cognizant of the impact and the cost to others, in my opinion, means you've got the kind of thought process that will make you an effective leader.
Just so that you know, Mark, Mitch has come in and said Up, Down or Sideways is a great read. So obviously somebody who picked it up 10 years ago and recommends it again. Two final questions and then we're done, Mark. The first one, very simply, somebody's, I think, trying to tap into all of your research into emotions. What do you think the main emotion in society will be early next year? And how do you think we could address that?
Well, I think the main emotion right now is fear. And what we have to morph that to, what we have to try to engineer that to is confidence, reasonable confidence. It's funny, not funny, but it's odd to me. In the United States, 38,800 people died in car accidents last year, but we still drive cars. And people say, well, that's a non-starter. They're not equivocals. Yes, they are. It's every activity has a risk associated with it. And between seat belts and airbags, we've mitigated the risk of an accident taking your life. And whatever the crisis is, that's what we've got to do. We've got to mitigate, but we can't, in most cases, eliminate. Even polio, I've read, which we thought was eradicated, polio has popped up again in different parts of the world. So the primary emotion right now, I'm guessing this isn't quantitative research, is probably fear. What I hope a year from now it will be is confidence, because when we come through this successfully, that will create a great deal of personal and organizational confidence for everyone.
I love that answer. And I think that's exactly right. As you say, we cannot eliminate risk completely. So we've got to learn what is acceptable risk and how to operate in that. Final question, and this is a softball to finish it. Wayne asks, do you have a great example of good leadership at the moment during the COVID crisis? Somebody who's kind of a complete epitome of everything you talk about in your book, and it gives you one final opportunity to summarize your main points as well.
Well, thank you for the question. It's hard to evaluate leaders on sound bites. We can all reach conclusions about the people we see on TV. Are they doing a good job, bad job? Many years ago, I had a chance to meet Walter Mondale, and he said something that shaped my life. He said, the less information you have, the easier it is to make a decision. So what I would do is, rather than focus on someone that everybody knows and probably is a polarizing figure either way, in the book, I talk about 5 different companies: a university, a restaurant, a small husband and wife team, a lawn care company, an insurance company, and a university. And the reason I use that diversity of examples is because I wanted to test if these ideas were just something that worked in a for-profit business. And what I was gratified to find is they worked across all those businesses. One of the companies is called Acuity Insurance. in a nutshell, and if you read the book, you'll read about them. They are the coolest insurance company you've probably never heard of. And they just take such great care of their employees. They do an onboarding process that'll blow your mind. And so when the COVID crisis started, I sent a text to one of my contacts there and I said, "How are you doing?" And he said, "We're doing great." We were absolutely prepared, not because they knew COVID was coming, but because of the systems they'd already put in place for virtual and remote work. And he said the transition has been very smooth. So if you want to deep dive into maybe why they've done such a good job and why Ben Salzman, the CEO there, is one of my favorite CEOs, you can read about it in The Intention Imperative.
Mark, as always, it's lovely to listen to you. I could sit in your audiences all day. Now, everybody who's joined us today, you know why I wanted to interview Mark and just get some of his insights. The great news for all of you is that you might not have been able to get Mark to come and speak at your business or to your team in the past because he has a very packed and limited travel schedule. But now with a click of a button, you can be anywhere in the world, Mark. So if anybody's interested, one more time, marksanborn.com and his latest book, The Intention Imperative, which is still hugely valuable, even in this COVID-19 world. Mark, thanks for your time. Great to see you, buddy. We'll catch up sometime soon.
My pleasure, Graham. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.